Dust coated the roof of her mouth like cheap chalk. 50 men stood behind the firing line, snickering as Quinn picked up the rusted, splintered Mark 12 sniper system discarded in the dirt. Its optic hung by a single sheared screw. Target drones shrieked overhead, cutting the dry wind at 80 miles an hour. She didn't check the windage. She didn't adjust the stock. She just wiped sweat from her eye, racked the gritty bolt, and exhaled. The Mojave Desert didn't care about naval traditions, and it certainly didn't care about the brass's diversity quotas. It only cared about heat, and the heat was currently baking the back of Quinn's neck to the color of raw brick. She stood at the rear of the firing line, shifting her weight off her left knee. The joint had been grinding like a dry transmission since the 10-mile ruck march that morning, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated up her thigh. She tasted salt. Her lips were cracked, shedding tiny flakes of dry skin every time she grimaced. The air smelled of burnt cordite hot brass and the sour, sharp tang of 30 unwashed bodies crammed onto a sun-blasted ridge. 50 yards ahead, the drone catapults hissed with pneumatic malice. "Next," barked Instructor Henderson. He was a fireplug of a man's skin like old saddle leather, chewing on a wad of sunflower seeds that he spat onto the dirt with rhythmic contempt. Trainee O'Neill stepped up. O'Neill was a golden boy from Coronado, built like a comic book hero, and armed with a pristine, suppressed M110 sniper system that cost more than Quinn's first car. Hiss, thwack, a bright orange target drone launched from the scrub brush, tearing across the horizon. These weren't the slow, lumbering balloons of basic training. These were aerodynamic carbon fiber wedges, mimicking fast-moving technical vehicles, screaming horizontally across the range at 80 miles per hour. O'Neill dropped prone. His rifle barked. "Miss!" Dust kicked up 3 feet behind the drone. He adjusted, fired again. "Miss!" The drone banked hard, dropping behind a dune. "Too slow, O'Neill. You're tracking it like a tourist watching a seagull." Henderson drawled, spitting a seed shell that landed near O'Neill's boot. "Clear it and get off my line." A low murmur rippled through the rest of the candidates. If O'Neill couldn't hit it with his custom glass and match-grade ammunition, the rest of them were in for a long, humiliating afternoon. Quinn stepped forward. The gravel crunched under her boots. She didn't feel a surge of heroic determination. She didn't feel the weight of history on her shoulders as the only female in the platoon. Mostly, she just felt a profound, exhausting irritation, a desire for a cold glass of tap water, and an acute awareness of the blister bursting on her right heel. She unslung her rifle, dropped to a knee, and slammed a magazine home. "Send it," she croaked. Her voice was raspy, stripped of moisture. Henderson raised his radio. "Bird away." The catapult hissed. The orange blur shot out from the right. Quinn tracked it, her cheek welded to the stock, her finger applying steady pressure to the trigger. She breathed in, paused, and squeezed. Click, not a bang. A dead, hollow click. Quinn frowned. She racked the charging handle, ejecting a live round into the dirt, and squeezed again. Click, she rolled the weapon over. The bolt carrier group was jammed, halfway wedged tight against a piece of sheared metal from a catastrophic internal failure. The firing pin retaining pin had snapped, lodging itself deep in the upper receiver. Her primary weapon was dead, a heavy, expensive club. "Malfunction," Quinn said, keeping her voice flat. Henderson laughed. A short, breathy sound. "Well, Davis, the Taliban won't call a timeout for your broken toy. You have 30 seconds to get back in the fight." "My bolt is locked, Instructor. I need a tool." "I didn't ask for a mechanics report, Davis. I said you have 30 seconds. Find a weapon." Quinn looked around. The armorer's tent was a quarter-mile down the ridge. The only thing nearby was a greasy canvas tarp sitting in the shade of Henderson's truck. It was the deadline pile weapons pulled from the training rotation because they were hopelessly broken, awaiting a trip back to the depot for scrap parts. 20 seconds, Henderson sang out. Someone in the back row chuckled. It wasn't a booming, theatrical villain laugh. It was a subtle, dismissive snort. The sound of boys watching someone finally fail a test they never thought she should have been allowed to take in the first place. Quinn's jaw tightened. She didn't glare at them. She just stood up, her joints popping, and walked toward the dirty tarp. The heat radiating off the truck's engine block distorted the air, making the pile of broken rifles look like they were writhing. She reached down and grabbed the first long gun her hand touched. It was a nightmare, an old beat-to-hell Mark 12 Mod 1. The paint was worn down to bare, shiny aluminum. The suppressor was rusted tight to the barrel, covered in a chalky white residue. But the worst part was the optic. It was an ancient Leupold scope, and the forward-mounting ring had sheared completely off. The heavy glass cylinder sagged downward, tethered only by the rear ring, flopping loosely against the handguard like a broken limb. 10 seconds, Henderson said, amused. Quinn hauled the junked rifle back to the firing line. The weight of it was all wrong. The balance was entirely nose-heavy, and the pistol grip was wrapped in degraded duct tape that immediately left a sticky, foul-smelling residue on her palm. "You're kidding, right?" O'Neill muttered as she passed him. "That thing's a liability. Just take the fail Davis." Quinn didn't answer. She dropped to the dirt, ignoring the sharp, jagged rock that immediately dug into her lower ribs. She wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. She was doing it because the idea of standing down and accepting the smug, knowing looks from 50 exhausted men made her stomach churn with a cold, spiteful acidity. She brought the rifle to her shoulder. The buttstock was missing its rubber pad, exposing a hard plastic grid that dug painfully into her clavicle. She looked through the optic. It was worse than she thought. The glass was spider-webbed with a deep crack in the lower left quadrant, and because the front ring was broken, the crosshairs were canted at a sickening 30-degree angle. Every time she breathed, the front of the scope dipped, tapping against the metal rail with a pathetic clink-clink. 5 seconds? Henderson warned, folding his arms. The sunflower seeds stopped flying. Even he seemed curious to see how badly this was going to end. Quinn's mind raced. Zeroing this weapon was impossible. The reticle wasn't just off, it was entirely decoupled from the barrel's axis. If she aimed the crosshairs at the target, the barrel would be pointing at the ground 3 feet to the left. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She didn't search for some zen state of absolute calm. She let the anger in. The petty, irritating anger at the sand in her boots, the blister on her foot, the sticky tape on her hand, and the heavy, expectant silence of the men behind her. She opened her eyes. Adapt. She shifted her left hand. Instead of gripping the rail, she slid her hand back toward the receiver. She clamped her thumb down hard over the top of the loose optic, pinching it directly against the metal rail. It wasn't perfectly aligned, but it stopped the wobbling. It locked the broken scope in place through sheer brute force grip strength. The grit from the rail dug under her fingernail. She ignored it. She peered through the cracked glass again. Okay, the crosshairs were useless. But looking over the optic, she could see the front iron sight. She mentally superimposed the front post over the cracked glass of the scope, creating an improvised, deeply flawed sight picture. It was a crude estimation, like trying to thread a needle while looking through the bottom of a cloudy beer glass. "Time," Henderson said. "Send 5. Good luck." He hit the remote. The catapult shrieked. A drone rocketed out from the left flank, 80 miles an hour. A bright orange blur tearing through the heat mirage. Quinn's finger found the trigger. It didn't have a clean, crisp break. It felt mushy, filled with desert sand and carbon fouling. It felt like dragging a cinder block across a gravel road. She tracked the blur. Because her sight picture was entirely improvised, she couldn't rely on the standard math. She had to feel the speed. She swung the heavy, rusted barrel leading the drone by 3 body lengths. She forced the gritty trigger back. Crack! The rifle bucked violently. The hard plastic of the stock punched her collarbone. The smell of cheap old gunpowder flooded her nostrils, sour and pungent. She kept both eyes open, watching the dust. A tiny puff of sand exploded 10 feet in front of the drone, too far ahead and low. The men behind her fell dead silent. No one was laughing anymore. They weren't awed. They were just quietly waiting for the inevitable washout. The drone banked, accelerating into an evasive arc. Quinn didn't pause to curse. Her right hand racked the bolt. It was stiff, requiring her to strike it with the heel of her hand to force the next round into battery. She adjusted. She pulled her point of aim up by a hair, letting off the lead just slightly. She wasn't doing ballistics in her head. She was calculating with the sore muscles in her shoulder, feeling the geometry of the shot in the raw tension of her forearms. She clamped the scope down harder, her thumb turning white. Crack! The orange drone didn't just break, it detonated. The 5.56 round clipped the internal battery pack. A shower of sparks and shattered carbon fiber rained down on the desert floor. The smoking chassis tumbled into the scrub brush. Quinn didn't smile. She didn't let out a breath of relief. Her eyes were already scanning the horizon. Hiss, thwack. Henderson, trying to catch her off guard, had launched 2 drones simultaneously from opposite flanks. They were crossing paths in the center, a chaotic high-speed X pattern designed to induce target panic. Quinn's breathing turned shallow and rhythmic. The world tunneled. The snickers, the heat, the sticky tape, it all fell away, leaving only the violent geometry of speed and distance. She swung right. The right flank drone was moving faster, caught in a tailwind. She smashed the bolt forward with her palm, slapped the trigger through its terrible, gritty resistance. Crack! The right drone splintered its starboard wing, snapping off as it spiraled out of the sky. Rack! Copper smell. Hot brass ejecting and searing a red line across her bare forearm. She didn't flinch. She swung hard to the left. The second drone was already past the center point, entering its evasive dive. It was dropping altitude, fast, skimming the tops of the creosote bushes. Quinn's thumb was cramping, aching fiercely from holding the broken optic down. Her improvised sight picture was shifting. She guessed the drop leading the drone not where it was, but where it was going to hit the deck. Crack! A violent puff of orange dust and grey smoke. A direct hit on the central fuselage. The drone skipped across the desert floor like a stone on water before coming to a violent halt. 3 down. Behind her the silence had changed. It was no longer expectant. It was heavy thick with a grudging, uncomfortable realization. O'Neill shifted his weight, his boots crunching loudly in the quiet. 2 more, Henderson murmured. His voice lacked its previous mockery. Hiss. The 4th drone was a straightaway shot, fleeing directly away from her, climbing in altitude. This was a nightmare for an unzeroed weapon. Judging drop on a fleeing target with no reference points in a broken scope was pure guesswork. Quinn's eye burned. Sweat pooled in the cup of her collarbone. She tracked the climbing orange dot. She held her breath, the crosshairs, or her mental image of them, hovering just above the target. She pulled the trigger. Click! A misfire. The primer was dented, but it didn't ignite. The drone was getting smaller, approaching the edge of the range limit. Quinn didn't panic. Her hand shot to the charging handle, aggressively ripping it back. The dead round spun out into the dirt. She let the bolt slam home, stripping a fresh round. She acquired the target again. It was a speck now, traveling at 80 miles an hour, 300 yards out, and climbing. She squeezed. Crack, a long beat of silence. The recoil faded. The ringing in her ears pitched high and thin. Far out over the dunes, the tiny orange dot suddenly lost its upward trajectory. It folded in half and dropped like a dead bird, vanishing behind the shimmering heat mirage. 4. Last bird. Henderson said, his voice entirely flat. He didn't hit the button immediately. He waited. He was trying to let her heart rate spike, trying to let the adrenaline crash. Quinn knew the game. She kept her cheek welded to the nasty, sticky stock. She kept her thumb clamped on the hot, broken metal of the scope. The barrel was smoking now, a thin grey ribbon rising in the still air. Hiss. The final drone didn't launch from the front. It came from a hidden trap on the far left, cutting across the entire firing line at a harsh diagonal moving faster than any of the others. It was a purely horizontal deflection, shot the hardest shot in the book. Quinn swung the heavy rifle. Her hip caught on the jagged rock beneath her, tearing a hole in her uniform pants. She didn't care. She tracked the drone. It was a blur. She couldn't even see the front sight post anymore through the glare of the cracked glass. She didn't aim. She just pushed the rifle ahead of the blur, feeling the weight of the steel, the wind against her cheek, the gritty friction of the trigger mechanism. She waited for the exact fraction of a second, where the tension in her gut aligned with the movement in her eye. She ripped the trigger back. Crack. The drone disintegrated. It didn't just break, it turned into a cloud of confetti. She had hit it dead center, the 5.56 round tumbling violently through its core. The echoes of the gunshot rolled across the canyon, bouncing off the distant rocks, and then died away. Only the wind remained. Quinn slowly lowered the rifle. She didn't drop it. She kept it pointed down range, hit the magazine release, and watched the empty mag fall onto the sand. She pulled the bolt back, locked it open, and inspected the chamber. Empty. Safe. She pushed herself up off the dirt. Her knee popped loudly. The blister on her heel screamed as she put weight on it. She wiped her hands on her trousers, trying to get the sticky residue off her palms, but it only smeared the desert dust into a fine paste. She turned around. 50 men stared at her. O'Neill was looking at the dirt. The guy who had chuckled earlier was staring at the crumpled piece of duct tape hanging off her rifle's grip. Henderson stood by his truck, a fresh handful of sunflower seeds frozen halfway to his mouth. He looked at the broken rifle, then at the smoking debris fields scattered across the desert. Quinn didn't say a word. She didn't give them a smirk. She didn't drop a one-liner about the Taliban. She simply walked past Henderson, picked up her canteen from the dirt, unscrewed the cap, and drank the warm, plastic-tasting water. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. The adrenaline didn't drain away all at once. It leaked out slowly, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her bones. The hike back to the cantonment area was 3 miles of loose shale and punishing uphill switchbacks. The sun, finally beginning its long, brutal dip behind the Sierra Nevadas, painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The heat remained trapped in the rock, radiating upward to bake them from the ground up. Quinn marched in the rear. Her right leg was dragging. The blister on her heel had popped somewhere around mile 1, and now the raw, exposed dermis was grinding against the damp wool of her sock with every step. It felt like walking on broken glass. She didn't limp. Limping was a visible metric of weakness. Instead, she altered her gait entirely, locking her knee and swinging her hip forward in a stiff, unnatural rhythm, that sent sharp jolts of pain directly into her lower back. She still carried the broken Mark 12. Instructor Henderson hadn't told her to put it back on the scrap pile, and in this environment, assumptions were punishable offences. So she carried it. The rusted suppressor banged rhythmically against her thigh, a heavy, dead weight. Her hands were stained black from the carbon and sticky from the degraded duct tape. She could smell the iron tang of blood where the charging handle had scraped her knuckles raw. They reached the armory line just as the massive floodlights hummed to life, bathing the gravel compound in a harsh, sodium-yellow glare. Moths the size of sparrows immediately began throwing themselves against the glass bulbs with dull, rhythmic thuds. The armourer, a thick-necked petty officer with grease permanently embedded in his cuticles, stood behind the chain-link window. The other candidates were already turning in their immaculate M11OAs, receiving quick nods of approval. Quinn stepped up to the window and laid the junked Mark 12 on the worn rubber mat. It looked like a corpse on a coroner's table. The armourer stared at it. He looked up at Quinn, his eyes flat. "What the hell is this candidate?" he grunted, poking the loose, cracked optic with a thick finger. "My issued weapon suffered a catastrophic bolt failure on the line," Quinn said, keeping her voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Instructor Henderson directed me to source an alternative. I pulled this from the deadline pile. I need to turn it in, and I need a functional replacement for the night evolution." The armourer snorted. "You fired this piece of shit." "Yes, petty officer." He shook his head, pulling the rifle through the window. "Henderson's an asshole, and you're out of your mind. Stand by." He disappeared into the cages. Quinn stood at the window. Her legs were trembling. Not a dramatic cinematic shake, but a high-frequency micro-tremor in her quads that she couldn't suppress, no matter how hard she locked her joints. She crossed her arms, pressing her hands into her ribs to hide the trembling. The tear in her trousers flapped slightly in the dry evening breeze. The rock from the firing line had cut a shallow 2-inch groove into her hip. The blood had dried into a stiff, itchy crust against her skin. A moment later, the armourer returned, sliding a standard-issue M4A1 across the counter, heavily coated in CLP oil. It smelled like solvents and clean metal. "Sign the roster," he said. Quinn scribbled her name with a cheap plastic pen that snapped in her grip. She shoved the broken pieces into her pocket, grabbed the rifle, and walked toward the chow hall. Inside, the noise was a physical wall. Plates clattering aluminum chairs, scraping against concrete. The low exhausted hum of 30 men trying to shovel as many calories into their faces as biologically possible before the night evolution began. The air smelled of boiled cabbage-burnt meatloaf and industrial floor wax. She grabbed a plastic tray that was still wet from the dishwasher. The food line was a blur of institutional grey and brown. She pointed at the meatloaf, pointed at the instant mashed potatoes. The server dumped a scoop of watery green beans over the potatoes. Quinn walked toward the seating area. The platoon had naturally segregated themselves. The officers at one table, the enlisted at another. O'Neill was sitting with 3 other candidates from his boat crew. They were talking in low tones, but the conversation abruptly died as she walked past. She didn't look at them. She found an empty spot at the end of a long metal table near the trash cans. The smell of rotting fruit and stale milk wafted over her every time someone opened the bin. She sat down, her body sinking onto the hard aluminum bench like a stone. She picked up a flimsy plastic spork and stared at her food. Her stomach rolled. The physical exertion had bypassed hunger entirely, landing her squarely in the realm of deep, nauseating exhaustion. She forced herself to eat. She didn't chew for taste. She chewed for fuel. The meatloaf was dry and tasted heavily of salt and filler. The potatoes were granular. She swallowed hard, taking a sip of lukewarm, heavily chlorinated tap water to wash it down. O'Neill stood up from his table, carrying his empty tray. He walked toward the trash cans, passing directly behind her. He paused. "Hey," he said. His voice was low. Quinn didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on her tray, mechanically scooping up a green bean. "Yeah, that was something. Back there." It wasn't a compliment. It was a concession. The tone was strained heavy with the awkward realization that the hierarchy of the platoon had just fractured in a way none of them were prepared for. Quinn chewed the green bean. It tasted like tin. She swallowed. "It was a broken gun, O'Neill. Don't overthink it." O'Neill lingered for a second longer, the silence stretching into something uncomfortable and thick. Then he dumped his tray with a loud clatter and walked away. Quinn didn't feel a rush of validation. She just felt tired. She looked down at her hands. The grease from the broken rifle was still lodged under her fingernails. She rubbed her thumb against her index finger, feeling the grit. There were still 6 weeks left. 6 weeks of cold, of heat, of broken gear and silent judgments. She took another bite of the dry meatloaf, forcing her jaw to work, preparing for the dark. The desert doesn't just cool down at night. It actively tries to freeze you to death. By 2200 hours, the temperature had plummeted 40 degrees. The residual heat from the rocks vanished, replaced by a biting, relentless wind that swept down from the mountains, carrying the faint scent of dry sage and alkali dust. Quinn lay flat on her stomach in the dirt, the M4 clutched to her chest. She was shivering. It wasn't the micro tremors from earlier. This was full-body violent shaking. Her teeth clicked together like a cheap castanet. She pressed her jaw tightly against the nylon strap of her helmet to muffle the sound. They were 2 hours into the night-stalking evolution. The objective was simple, yet entirely cruel. Navigate 2 miles of broken terrain, infiltrate a mock compound guarded by instructors with thermal optics, and steal a serialized radio without being detected. She reached up with a numb hand and pulled her night vision goggles down over her eyes. The world instantly snapped into a grainy, phosphorescent green nightmare. The depth perception was terrible. The scrub brush looked like jagged claws reaching out of the earth. Shadows were absolute. Highlights were blown out into blinding halos. She began to crawl. The technique was called the skull drag. Forearms, flat face, inches from the dirt, pulling the body forward, inches at a time, while keeping the hips completely flat. It was agonizingly slow. The cut on her hip immediately tore open again, the raw friction against the desert floor, sending fresh, hot spikes of pain radiating up her side. The blood made her trousers stick to her skin, chilling rapidly in the freezing wind. Just move. 1 foot, then the next. She dragged herself over a patch of dried cholla cactus. The dead needles snapped a sound that felt deafening in the silence of the night. She froze, burying her face in the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the crack of an instructor's flare, the shout of a spotter, the humiliating blast of an air horn, signaling she had been compromised. Nothing but the wind. She resumed crawling. Her elbows were rubbed raw through the thick fabric of her uniform. The cold was seeping into her core. She could feel her extremities shutting down her fingers, turning stiff and clumsy. She crested a small ridge and looked down through the green wash of her NVGs. The mock compound sat in a shallow depression 200 yards away. A single dull red light marked the objective. 2 instructors stood near a rusted shipping container, their silhouettes sharply defined against the lighter sand. One of them was holding a thermal scanner to his eye, sweeping the ridgeline. Quinn flattened herself. Thermal optics couldn't see through solid objects, but they could pick up body heat radiating through thin brush. She needed a micro-terrain feature to mask her approach. A ditch, a dry wash, anything. She scanned the ground to her left. A narrow erosion rut snaked its way down the hill, barely 18 inches deep. It was her only path. She angled her body and slid into the rut. It was filled with loose, powdery silt that immediately went up her nose, tasting of ancient minerals and decay. She kept her head down, closing her eyes, relying entirely on the feel of the narrow trench walls against her shoulders to guide her. The pain in her hip was becoming a dull, rhythmic throb. Her mind started to wander the cold and exhaustion fraying her focus. She thought about her apartment back in San Diego, the radiator that hissed in the corner, the smell of fresh coffee, the soft, heavy weight of a down comforter. It was a dangerous, seductive train of thought. It was the brain's way of offering an exit. Just stand up and walk down there. They have coffee in the instructor tent. They have heaters. All you have to do is quit. She bit her cracked lip, tasting fresh metallic blood. She welcomed the sharp sting. It anchored her. It pushed the thoughts of the radiator away. She dragged herself another 50 yards. She was close now. She could hear the low murmur of the instructors talking. Telling you the thermal is glitching on the left side. A voice floated up on the wind. Stop making excuses, Carter. Sweep the drawer. Quinn froze. She was in the drawer. She pressed her face into the silt, trying to make herself as small as possible. She imagined the white-hot signature of her body glowing on their screen, a beacon in the cold desert night. She slowed her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. A slow, controlled leak of air. Clink. Her M4's sling swivel cold and brittle, tapped against the side of the erosion rut. It was a tiny sound, barely a whisper, but in the desert at 2 a.m. it was a siren. Hold up, the voice said. Got a heat bloom. Grid 09er lower left. Quinn closed her eyes. The frustration was a physical weight pressing down on the back of her neck. She had survived the scrap pile. She had survived the long march. And now she was going to fail because of a 2-cent piece of stamped metal tapping against a rock. She didn't wait for the flare. She didn't wait for them to call her out. She broke the rules. Instead of staying frozen, playing the victim to the thermal scanner, she violently rolled onto her back, bringing her legs up. She shoved her boots hard against the side of the rut, triggering a localized collapse of the dirt wall. A shower of dry silt and rocks cascaded down, creating a small dust cloud and a very obvious loud rustling noise. Movement, the instructor barked. Quinn didn't stay in the rut. Using the momentary distraction of the falling dirt, she scrambled out of the trench on her belly, sliding sideways like a crab into a thick patch of thorny mesquite brush. She ignored the thorns ripping into her sleeves and forearms. She burrowed deep into the center of the bush, tucking her head down, burying her thermal signature beneath the dense layer of cold, woody branches. A magnesium parachute flare exploded overhead with a loud pop, turning the night into a sickly, flickering daylight. The shadows danced wildly. Quinn held her breath. A thorn was embedded deep in her cheek, just below her right eye. She didn't blink. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Someone was walking up the ridge directly towards the collapsed rut. Nothing, a voice muttered, sounding irritated. Coyote, maybe, or the bank just gave way. Thermal's clear now. Back to your post. The footsteps receded. The flare hissed, sputtered, and died, plunging the world back into the cold, grainy green dark. Quinn lay in the thorns for 10 long minutes. Her chest heaved. The cut on her cheek throbbed in time with her heartbeat. It was ugly, it was improvised, and it was entirely ungraceful. but she was still invisible. She slowly extracted herself from the mesquite, the thorns tearing at her uniform, and began the final crawl towards the rusted shipping container. The Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, was a large olive-drab temper tent pitched on a concrete pad 2 miles from the cantonment area. Inside, it smelled of stale chewing tobacco, burnt coffee, and the sharp ozone tang of overheated radio equipment. The harsh fluorescent tube lights strung from the ceiling hummed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. Quinn stood at the position of attention in front of a folding table. She was covered in pale, chalky dust. The right side of her trousers was dark and stiff with dried blood. A long, angry red scratch ran down her cheek, swelling slightly around the edges. She had the serialized radio sitting on the table in front of her. She had made the time hack. Barely. Behind the table sat Instructor Henderson and another man, Chief Carter, a gaunt, hollow-eyed veteran who looked like he had been constructed entirely of beef jerky and spite. Carter picked up the radio, inspected the serial number, and dropped it back on the table with a clatter. He didn't look impressed. He looked bored. "Candidate Davis," Henderson said, leaning back in his squeaky metal chair. He was absent-mindedly rolling a plastic challenge coin across his knuckles. "You compromised your position in the draw." "Yes, Instructor," Quinn said. Her voice was completely blown out, a harsh, grating whisper. The cold air had stripped her throat raw. "Chief Carter here had you dead to rights on the thermal, and then you initiated a micro-avalanche to mask your thermal signature and relocate." "Yes, Instructor." Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That was a reckless, noisy maneuver, Davis. You gave away your general position to mask your specific position. In a real-world scenario, you wouldn't have just gotten a flare. You would have gotten a mortar dropped on your head." "I was compromised, Chief. I prioritized immediate signature reduction over acoustic stealth. I made a localized call based on the terrain." Carter stared at her, his eyes flat and unreadable. He reached for a spit cup made from a sawed-off water bottle and spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into it. "It was sloppy," Carter said softly. "But it worked. Barely." Henderson stopped rolling the coin. He placed it flat on the table. He looked at Quinn, really looked at her. He took in the torn uniform, the bleeding cheek, the exhausted, sunken posture she was fighting desperately to hide behind military bearing. "Let me ask you a question, Davis." Henderson said, his voice dropping the theatrical drill instructor bark. It became quiet, conversational. That was always worse. "Why did you pick up that Mark 12 today?" Quinn didn't answer immediately. She stared at a point on the canvas wall behind Henderson's head. "You told me to find a weapon, Instructor. Don't give me the robot answer, Davis." Henderson snapped, though there was no real heat in it. "You could have picked up a broken M4. You could have picked up an old shotgun. You picked up the heaviest, most fundamentally broken precision platform on that tarp. A gun with a sheared optic ring. Why?" Quinn shifted her weight, ignoring the scream from her blistered heel. The silence in the tent stretched. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt loud. "Because—" Quinn started, her voice raspy. She stopped, cleared her dry throat, and tried again. "Because I knew the boys were waiting for me to fail." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "So it was pride." "No." Quinn said, her tone suddenly hardening. The exhaustion burned away for a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, deeply cynical honesty. "Pride implies I care what they think about me as a person. I don't. It was about math. If I took a standard failure, they'd write it off as the female candidate failing the standard. If I took the absolute worst, most mathematically impossible piece of garbage on that pile and hit the targets anyway, it removes the variable. It proves that the limitation isn't me, it's the gear. Carter chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound. Arrogant. Analytical, Quinn corrected, looking directly at Carter. Her eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion, but completely deadpan. I don't have the luxury of failing gracefully, Chief. My failures are public property. My successes are dismissed as quotas. So I have to be undeniable, even if it means using a broken scope. Henderson leaned back again, studying her. The silence returned heavier this time. He didn't offer a nod of respect. He didn't give a speech about breaking barriers. This wasn't a movie. This was a selection course, and giving an inch of validation was against the doctrine. You hit 5 targets at 80 miles an hour with an unzeroed, structurally compromised weapon. Henderson said, stating it as a clinical fact. You passed the Night Stalk by employing a desperate, highly unorthodox evasion tactic. Yes, instructor. Henderson picked up a clipboard, made a single check mark with a pen, and tossed it back on the table. Your rifle marksmanship is adequate. Your fieldcraft is borderline suicidal, but currently functional, Henderson said. He looked back up at her, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth. But understand this, Davis. Surviving the scrap pile doesn't make you special. It just means you didn't quit today. Tomorrow the targets move faster, the temperature drops lower, and your margins for error disappear completely. Understood, instructor. Get out of my TOC, go clean your weapon, and patch that cut on your face before you bleed on my armory floor. Aye, instructor. Quinn executed a sharp, about-face. Her hip ground painfully, her joints stiff from the cold and the adrenaline crash. She walked out of the tent, pushing the heavy canvas flap aside. The wind hit her instantly, biting through her damp uniform. The night sky above the Mojave was clear, a vast, indifferent canopy of cold, hard stars. She stood there for a moment in the dark, shivering violently, her hands shoved deep into her armpits. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a legend in the making. She was just tired, cold, bleeding, and hungry. She turned and began the long, agonizing walk toward the cleaning bays, the cold metal of the M4 bumping against her back. 1 day down, 41 left to go, day 34. The platoon had evaporated. Out of the original 50 men who had stood on the firing line, only 16 remained, plus Quinn. The desert had stripped away the golden boys, the track stars, and the gym rats who thought muscle mass equated to endurance. What was left was a collection of gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts, held together by sports tape ibuprofen and a stubborn, toxic refusal to ring the bell. The smell of the barracks was a physical wall. It was a potent, gag-inducing cocktail of ammonia from degrading, sweat-rotting canvas iodine and the sharp, fungal odor of chronic foot rot. Nobody cared anymore. Vanity had died in week 2. Quinn sat on the edge of her metal rack at 0300 hours. The thin mattress offered zero support, the springs digging into the bruised meat of her thighs. She was staring at her left knee. It was swollen to the size of a honeydew melon, the skin stretched tight and shiny, colored in sickly shades of violet and yellow. She reached into her footlocker and pulled out a roll of heavy industrial duct tape. The medical staff would pull her from the course if they saw the joint, diagnosing it as a severe patella tracking issue. So she didn't show them. She ripped off a long strip of tape with her teeth. The adhesive tasted bitter and chemical. She anchored the tape to her shin, pulled it upward with a sharp, violent jerk to physically force the kneecap back into alignment and wrapped it tight around her thigh. She gasped. A short, ugly sound. Her vision swam with grey spots. You're going to tear the ligament completely, Davis. Quinn looked across the narrow aisle. Cobb was awake. He was a farm kid from Nebraska, built like a cinder block but currently looking like a skeleton wrapped in pale skin. He was carefully applying superglue to a deep, open fissure on his heel. "Mind your own feet, Cobb," Quinn rasped. Her voice was permanently hoarse from inhaling alkali dust. "Just saying," Cobb muttered, pressing the edges of his split skin together as the glue smoked and cured. "Henderson's looking for a reason to drop you today. It's the log." The log. A 300-pound telephone pole that had been soaking in a brine pit for a week to maximize its weight and slime factor. They were scheduled to carry it over 6 miles of jagged scree slopes. Quinn finished taping her knee, pulling her abrasive, salt-crusted trousers over the bulky joint. "Henderson is always looking for a reason. If the knee goes, it goes. Until then, I carry." At 0400 hours, they were in the dirt. The temperature was 32 degrees. The wind howled off the ridgeline, carrying fine particles of sand that sandblasted any exposed skin. "Lift!" Carter barked. Quinn was positioned on the back right quadrant of the log. O'Neill was directly in front of her. At the command, they hoisted the massive waterlogged timber onto their right shoulders. The impact was devastating. The bark was stripped, leaving a slimy, porous surface that immediately soaked through Quinn's uniform, chilling her shoulder down to the bone. The sheer crushing weight pressed into the deep tissue bruise on her collarbone, a remnant from the broken MK-12's recoil weeks ago. "Move forward and march." They began to walk. It wasn't a march, it was a staggered, agonizing shuffle. The terrain was composed of loose, flat shale. Every step was a gamble. If one person slipped, the weight shifted dynamically, crushing the spines of the men next to them. "Keep the cadence, O'Neill." Henderson yelled from the sidelines, comfortably riding in an idling ATV. He spat a stream of sunflower seeds onto the ground. "Your dragging Davis is practically carrying your weight back there." It was a deliberate psychological needle. Henderson knew exactly what he was doing. O'Neill's back stiffened. He tried to push upward, but his legs were jelly. He was compensating for a lower back injury he was hiding, just like Quinn was hiding her knee. His boot hit a patch of loose shale. He slipped. The 300-pound log violently dropped 6 inches on the right side. The sudden shock transferred directly into Quinn's spine. Her taped knee buckled under the immense pressure. A sharp, white-hot spike of agony shot from her patella up into her jaw. She tasted copper. She was going down. If she went down, the log would crush her and the evolution would be failed. No, she didn't dig deep into a reservoir of patriotic duty. She tapped into pure, black spite. Quinn locked her jaw, threw her left leg out wide for stability, and shoved her right shoulder upward with a brutal, guttural scream. The tape on her knee shrieked as it stretched, tearing the hair and top layer of skin off her leg. She forced the log back up, absorbing O'Neill's slack. For 3 terrifying seconds, she carried over 150 pounds of dead weight entirely alone on one bad leg. The veins in her neck bulged, pressing against the collar of her uniform. Her vision tunneled into a pinpoint of blackness. O'Neill scrambled, finding his footing, and pushed back up. The weight equalized. "Watch your goddamn feet, O'Neill," Quinn hissed through clenched teeth. Her breath was hot, smelling of stale coffee and stomach acid. O'Neill didn't look back. "I slipped." "Slip again and I'll break your other leg," she lied. She didn't have the energy to break a twig. They marched for 2 hours. The sun began to crest the horizon, offering no warmth, only a harsh, blinding glare that illuminated the absolute misery on the candidates' faces. The brine from the log dripped into Quinn's eye, stinging viciously. She couldn't wipe it. Her hands were locked in a death grip around the timber. Her mind began to fragment. The physical pain was so absolute that her brain started attempting to detach from her body. She found herself staring at the rhythmic swaying of O'Neill's canteens attached to his webbing. Left, right, left, right. She started doing complex math equations in her head to stay awake, calculating the trajectory of a 175-grain bullet over 1,000 yards in a full-value crosswind. Anything to avoid feeling the knee. "Drop it," Carter yelled over a bullhorn. The team heaved the log off their shoulders. It hit the dirt with a massive, dull thud, kicking up a cloud of white dust. Quinn collapsed. She didn't mean to. Her right leg simply stopped receiving signals from her nervous system. She hit the shale hard, scraping her forearms, her chest heaving as she sucked in the thin, freezing air. Henderson walked over. He looked down at her. His boots were immaculate, polished leather. "You done, Davis?" he asked quietly. "Medical is right over there. They have a heated tent, coffee, blankets. Just say the word. Nobody will judge you. You made it further than anyone thought." It was the most dangerous weapon the instructors had. Empathy. A cold, hard drill sergeant was easy to hate, easy to push back against. But a quiet, reasonable offer of relief when you were in agonizing pain that broke more candidates than the log ever could. Quinn looked at his polished boots. She looked at the medical tent 50 yards away. She could almost smell the coffee. She rolled onto her side. She placed her hands flat on the sharp rocks. She pushed herself up. Her knee screamed a terrifying grinding sensation that made her nauseous. She stood up, swaying slightly, and locked her eyes on Henderson. "I'm ready for the next evolution, instructor." Henderson stared at her for a long, silent moment. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of seeds, and popped them in his mouth. "Form up. Live fire in 20, he said, turning away. Quinn wiped a mixture of brine, sweat, and dirt from her face. She looked at O'Neill. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable. He offered her a canteen. She took it, drank the lukewarm, plastic-tasting water, and handed it back without a word. They were just meat in the grinder now. The kill house was a sprawling, multi-level monstrosity, constructed entirely from rusted shipping containers, stacked haphazardly in the center of a dry lake bed. Inside, it was a dark, claustrophobic labyrinth of plywood walls, catwalks, and pop-up steel targets. By hour 58 of the continuous training cycle, the candidates were effectively sleepwalking. Their cognitive functions were severely degraded. Sentences trailed off halfway through. Hands fumbled with simple mechanisms. Quinn stood stacked against the corrugated steel wall of the breach point. She was the number 2 man. Cobb was point. O'Neill was number 3. They were wearing 30 pounds of body armor, heavy Kevlar helmets, and carrying fully loaded M4s with live, frangible ammunition. The air inside the compound was stagnant, smelling heavily of burnt gunpowder ozone from flashbangs and the metallic tang of old blood from previous classes who had caught shrapnel. "Breach, breach, breach," an instructor screamed from the catwalk above. Cobb kicked the plywood door. It shattered inward. He threw a flashbang into the dark room. 1-2 bang. The concussive wave hit Quinn in the chest, sucking the air out of her lungs. The brilliant white flash seared through her dark adapted vision, leaving a massive green spot floating in her eyes. Cobb flooded into the room. Quinn went directly off his hip, hooking left into the deep corner. "Clear left," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Clear right," Cobb yelled. They moved fluidly, a synchronized dance born of endless, brutal repetition. They pushed through a narrow hallway. The floor was covered in spent brass casings that rolled treacherously beneath their boots. Suddenly, a steel target popped up from behind a low barricade directly in front of Cobb. It depicted an armed combatant holding a hostage. Cobb brought his rifle up. He squeezed the trigger. Click, a weapon malfunction, specifically a double feed. 2 live rounds jammed simultaneously into the chamber, locking the bolt carrier group completely solid. It was the worst possible malfunction in a close-quarters environment. In a rested state, Cobb would have recognized. It transitioned to his secondary pistol and engaged. But Cobb wasn't rested. He had been awake for nearly 3 days. His brain short-circuited. He stared at the jammed weapon, his eyes wide, his hands freezing. He didn't move off the center line. He stood perfectly still in the fatal funnel of the hallway, blocking O'Neill from moving up. "Transition, Cobb!" O'Neill screamed from behind, pushing into Cobb's back armor. Cobb didn't move. Panic, raw and irrational, seized him. He started yanking frantically on the locked charging handle, a futile, panicked gesture that only jammed the brass tighter into the star chamber. Above them, the instructor leaned over the catwalk. "He's dead. The whole stack is dead, fix it." The pop-up mechanism hissed. A second target, this one, purely a combatant, sprang up on the right flank, flanking their position. They were trapped in the hallway, blocked by their own point man. Quinn didn't think. There was no time for complex tactical analysis. She reacted purely on visceral instinct. She dropped her center of gravity, ignoring the agonizing pop in her taped knee. She reached out with her left hand, grabbing the heavy nylon drag handle on the back of Cobb's plate carrier. She didn't gently guide him out of the way. She violently heaved backward with everything she had. Cobb, caught off guard, flew backward. He crashed into O'Neill, and both men went down in a tangled heap of ceramic plates, rifles and limbs sliding across the brass-covered floor. The center line was clear, but Quinn was now entirely exposed, standing alone in the hallway facing 2 active targets. The combatant target on the right was fully locked out. Quinn snapped her M4 up. Her right arm was trembling from the log, carry her muscles screaming in protest. The holographic sight was a blurry red smear against the darkness of the container. She didn't aim for the surgical T-box. She just needed steel on target. She mashed the trigger. The rifle roared a deafening sequence of overlapping concussions in the enclosed space. The frangible rounds sparked violently against the steel plate. Ping, ping, ping. 3 rounds center mass. She didn't stop. She swung the barrel hard to the left, acquiring the hostage target. The margin of error was less than 3 inches between the hostage steel and the combatant steel. Her vision was swimming. The green spot from the flashbang obscured the target. Her lungs burned from the cordite smoke. Breathe. She couldn't. She just fired. Crack. The round struck the edge of the combatant plate, inches away from the white hostage plate. The steel violently clanged backward. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" the instructor bellowed. Quinn immediately dropped her weapon to the low ready, her finger snapping straight off the trigger, resting on the receiver. She was panting her chest, heaving violently against her armor. The silence that followed the gunfire was ringing a high-pitched tinnitus whine that drowned out the wind outside. She looked down. Cobb was sitting on the floor, staring at his jammed rifle. O'Neill was untangling himself, his face pale. The instructor climbed down the metal stairs from the catwalk. It was Chief Carter. He walked over to the targets, running a gloved hand over the fresh lead splatters on the steel. He walked back to the stack. He looked at Cobb. "You froze, candidate. You locked up in the funnel. You got yourself and your team killed in a real-world scenario." Cobb swallowed hard. "Yes, Chief. I experienced a double feed. I failed to transition." Carter turned to Quinn. She was standing perfectly still, though a bead of sweat was tracing a line through the carbon soot on her cheek. "Candidate Davis," Carter said softly. Yes, Chief. You aggressively displaced a teammate to clear your lane of fire. Point Man was frozen on the ex-chief. He was a fatal obstruction. I cleared the line to engage the immediate threat. Carter stared at her. He looked at her taped knee the way she was shifting 90% of her body weight onto her left leg. He looked at the bruised raw skin on her neck, where hot brass had ejected and burned her during the chaotic firing sequence. It was ugly, Carter said. It was frantic. You nearly broke his neck pulling him backward. Yes, Chief. Carter paused. The silence stretched in the dark, smoky shipping container. But you cleared the funnel, and you neutralized the threat without hitting the no-shoot. Function over form. Carter spat a small wad of tobacco into the corner of the room. Reset the doors, run it again. He walked away. Quinn let out a slow, shaking breath. She reached a hand down to Cobb. Cobb looked at her hand. He didn't say anything. He grabbed her wrist, and she hauled him to his feet. He cleared his jammed rifle in silence, his face burning with a mixture of shame and exhaustion. O'Neill stepped up beside her as they moved back to the starting point. He bumped his shoulder against hers. It wasn't an accident. It was a heavy, deliberate, physical acknowledgement. Nice pull, O'Neill muttered. Quinn didn't smile. Fix your spacing next time. If I have to pull him again, I'm throwing him at you. They stacked up on the plywood door. The fear was still there. The exhaustion was still there, but the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't the female candidate trying to survive the scrap pile anymore. She was just the number 2 man in the stack. The end didn't come with a parade. It didn't come with a swelling orchestral score or a dramatic sunrise. It came at 1400 hours on a dreary, overcast Tuesday in the middle of a muddy wash on the edge of the base limits. The remaining 12 candidates were lying on their backs in 2 feet of freezing, muddy water. They were performing flutter kicks with their boots on their core muscles, screaming, their bodies shaking so violently that the water around them churned into a brown froth. Quinn's eyes were closed. She wasn't calculating math equations anymore. She wasn't thinking about the apartment in San Diego. Her mind was a static void. There was only the command to lift her legs, the agonizing burn in her hip flexors, and the cold water rushing over her ears. Up, down, Henderson chanted, walking along the bank of the wash, his boots sinking into the mud. Up, down, up, down. Quinn's taped knee was completely numb. She assumed it was destroyed. She didn't care. She was a machine performing a singular task until the battery permanently died. Stop, a voice said. It wasn't a yell. It was spoken at a normal conversational volume, but it cut through the splashing water and the heavy breathing like a gunshot. The candidates froze their legs, hovering inches above the muddy water. Instructor Henderson stood on the bank. Chief Carter stood next to him. Recover, Henderson said. Slowly, agonizingly, 12 broken bodies rolled over in the mud and pushed themselves to their feet. They stood in a ragged line, dripping brown water, shivering uncontrollably. They looked like refugees from a war zone. Henderson looked down the line. He made eye contact with each of them. When he got to Quinn, his gaze lingered for a fraction of a second. There was no warmth, no sudden revelation of respect. Just a flat, clinical acknowledgement of a fact. She was still standing. Evolution complete, Henderson said quietly. Secure your gear. The trucks are waiting on the hardball road to take you back to Coronado for Phase 2. No one cheered. No one hugged. They didn't have the energy. O'Neill let out a long, ragged sigh, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline finally permanently left his system. Cobb leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, staring blankly at the mud. Quinn turned and began walking towards the embankment. The mud sucked violently at her boots, trying to pull her back down. Every step required a conscious, deliberate command from her brain to her leg. She reached the top of the bank and stepped onto the dry dirt. The wind hit her, freezing the wet uniform to her skin. She looked down at her hands. The grease from the broken Mach 12 on day one was finally gone, scrubbed away by sand mud and friction. Her fingernails were cracked, her knuckles permanently scarred. O'Neill fell into step beside her as they walked toward the distant silhouette of the idling transport trucks. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sound the squelch of their wet boots on the gravel. "Hey!" O'Neill finally croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Quinn looked at him. His face was a mask of dirt and exhaustion, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. "I thought you were going to quit on day one," he admitted, staring straight ahead. "When Henderson gave you that junk rifle, I thought you were just going to drop it and walk." Quinn kept walking. She looked out over the vast, empty expanse of the Mojave, the heat mirages shimmering in the distance, even under the overcast sky. "The rifle wasn't the test, O'Neill," she said softly, the harsh wind snatching the words from her cracked lips. "What was? It was the baseline." Quinn replied, her voice devoid of any triumph. Just a cold, grounded reality. "It was just the desert asking if we were willing to play with a rigged deck." O'Neill didn't answer. He didn't need to. He reached into his webbing, pulled out his last remaining canteen, and unscrewed the cap. He took a short sip, wiped the rim with a filthy thumb, and held it out to her. It was a silent, unceremonious offering. A recognition not of heroics, but of endurance. Quinn took the canteen. The plastic was scuffed and warm. She drank the stale metallic water, letting it wash away the taste of the alkali dust, the cordite, and the blood. She handed it back, adjusted the strap of her rifle over her bruised collarbone, and limped toward the trucks. The hardest part wasn't over. It was only just beginning. If Quinn's gritty, impossible victory against the odds made your pulse pound, don't let the story stop here. This is just the beginning of her journey through the most grueling training on Earth, where every tool is broken and every odd is stacked against her. Hit that like button if you respect the raw hustle. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that sheer willpower beats perfect gear every time, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of this explosive saga. Drop a comment below. How would you have handled that shot?